for joining us tonight for this special lecture, The Road to the Revolution, with our special guest tonight, Dr. Claudia Zapata. This event is sponsored by the Thomas P. Johnson Visiting Scholars and Artists Fund. And of course, this is in relation to the exhibition Thinking the Revolution in this gallery and the adjacent gallery, visiting here and traveling from the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Tonight, we're going to hear more about how this exhibition came to be. This has been a significant show for us here at the Rollins Museum of Art, and it has allowed us to share with our students and our community different perspectives by artists from different backgrounds. It has been great to have artists represented in this exhibition who are not currently represented in our collection. So this has been an exhibition that has supplemented what we do here at the Rollins Museum of Art.
Dr. Claudia Zapata earned their PhD in art history at Southern Methodist University's Rhetorics of Art, Space and Culture program. They received their B
and MA in art history from the University of Texas at Austin, specializing in Maya art. And from 2010 to 2014, Dr. Zapata was the curator of exhibitions and programs at the Mexican Art Museum. They held the position of curatorial assistant of Latinx art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum from 2018 to 2022. Currently, they are the Blanton Museum of Art's first associate curator of Latino art. Please help me welcome Dr. Zapata, and time at the end for questions.
So this show is coming originally from DC, from the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And so you're seeing the development of this show in terms of hurdles, political climates, racial reckoning, resistance, government shutdowns, you name it. So we'll talk a little bit about that. It's a really good example for museum studies for students and to just see the back end of what happens when you're developing an exhibition. And an exhibition particularly of this kind that's really ethnic specific. So wait till the end for your questions. All the questions are fine, whatever. There's no dumb questions. So just get ready. It's happening. Okay. So the exhibition, Fronting the Revolution, The Rise and Impact of Chicano Graphics, 1965 to now, is a national traveling exhibition that was first unveiled at the Smithsonian American Art Museum's main building in Washington, D.C., and is now currently on view here at the Rollins Museum of Art. Originally, the exhibition featured 119 works, including screen prints, digital graphics, augmented reality works, and site-specific installations by more than 74 artists of Mexican descent and other artists who were active in Chicanx networks. All of the artworks on display are part of the museum's permanent collection of Latinx art, one of the leading national collections of its kind, and one of the most extensive collections of Chicanx graphics in an American art-focused museum. This exhibition features donated artworks from major collectors and recently acquired works as part of an ambitious program to create an inclusive view of American art. Former acting head curator and curator of Latinx art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, Carmen Ramos, curated this exhibition, and I acted as the project's curatorial assistant. The exhibition was a significant programmatic undertaking. Along with the gallery exhibition, there was also a Princeton University Press exhibition catalog, collector interviews, artist and scholarly conversations, and other educational resources. The exhibition's development, unveiling, and presence were concurrent to several historic and unprecedented moments, including the 2020 US presidential election, the COVID-19 pandemic, the Capitol insurrection, the racial reckoning of 2020, and the museological era I refer to as the Great Reflection, wherein the museum industry critiqued its own relationship to diversity in collections, staff, and audiences. These momentous occasions resonated particularly in the Washington, D.C. area and echoed the thematic relevance of the Printing the Revolution exhibition and programming, and its central artistic tenets around anti oppression work, cultural solidarity, and political revolution. The show's development began with the Masibarro Frausto's print donation in 1995 to the Smithsonian American Art Museum. One of the most renowned scholars of Chicano art, Tomas has been advocating for Chicano art study, representation, and display across the nation since the 1960s. His early donations to the Smithsonian were part of an effort to preserve and share his personal collection he had amassed over the years as an activist, scholar, and collector. Tomas and other Texas and California collectors donated hundreds of works for the exhibition and the museum's collection. I highly recommend watching the online interviews available on Sam's YouTube channel that features interviews with Carmen Ramos and Tomas, as well as the other graphics collectors Gil Cardenas, Harriet and Ricardo Romo, and Rosa Terrazas on behalf of her aunt, Margaret Terrazas Santos. In these conversations, they explain their collecting practices and how these efforts were fueled by activism rather than financial portfolio betterment or asset diversification. Interesting to note, Margaret Terrazas Santos' estate was a later addition within our research process after someone from the estate contacted one of our catalog essayists after a general Google search. So this is the first appearance of Santos's collection in a national exhibition and the estate's first museum donation. The show's research process was a multi-year project. Beginning in 2018, Carmen and I interviewed Chicanx and Latinx scholars, curators, and artists, eventually conducting studio visits with prospective artists, collectors, and print centers across the nation. The exhibition preparation was twofold. We were curating for the exhibition as well as acquiring artwork with the objective of enhancing the museum's permanent collection. The result was a 300% increase in the Latinx art holdings. Printing the Revolution is a permanent collection exhibition, meaning all the works on display are part of the SAM's holdings. Usually, this type of exhibition format is meant to tout the institution's collecting vision. In this case, we were filling in gaps and remedying years of non-collecting of Chicanx and Latinx art by the Smithsonian American Art Museum prior to Carmen Ramos's hire in 2010. The exhibition's focus on specifically Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx art and Chicano artistic networks proved incredibly challenging given the complexity of the term Chicano. At every stage of the exhibition's inception and now travel, the varying relationships to this term elicits a unique response from audiences. There was also a consistent request and desire by Smithsonian public relations, marketing, and education departments to promote an exact institutional definition for the term Chicano, one that carried an institutional gravitas to its development. This proved a tense space given the fluidity of the term. I was often asked to explain this term, and I would demonstrate the many variations of the concept using this graphic. Typically, scholars cite Ruben Salazar, the esteemed journalist who was killed by an LA County Sheriff's tear gas projectile during the National Chicano Moratorium in 1970. A foundational definition by this slain journalist is, quote, a Chicano is a Mexican American with a non-Anglo image of himself, unquote. The museum's public relations department always wanted exactitudes and presumed no one would know what Chicano meant, therefore assuming an inherent cultural and conscious distance from any of the featured content. The exhibition's location in Washington, D.C. also dictated this presumption based on the region's lesser role in the Chicano movement and much smaller Mexican American communities in the Southwest, for example. As the exhibition is traveling, new considerations regarding the exhibition's terminology have emerged from staff arguing about their perceived definitions of the term. For example, one person's interpretation along the tour was that Chicano is a person removed from their Mexican culture, somewhat whitewashed, and devoid of their cultural heritage. Exhibition curator E. Carmen Ramos avoided giving exact definitions to the term Chicano, despite desires from other departments in the institution aiming for a more direct vocabulary set. Therefore, we employed other educational structures as a compromise regarding public explanations of our terms in online content. For example, we had a one-on-one written interview series featured on Smithsonian American Art Museum's blog, where E. Carmen Ramos and I wrote about the exhibition structure and themes, specifically the title, in order to tackle the terminology queries. In one entry, Carmen asked me the following question. Claudia, the term Chicano can be employed in several variations, such as Chicanx, Chicano, Chicana, and Chicanx, with multiple objectives for each term. Can you discuss the term's resilience? To which I wrote, quote, the term Chicano has multi-generational appeal, and its ability to be altered per the user's theoretical desires is a testament to its resilience and applicability. A foundational definition is by the slain journalist Ruben Salazar. A Chicano is a Mexican American with a non-Anglo image of himself. The often quoted definition highlights the Chicano movement's challenge to white supremacy and the decolonial consciousness of those employing the term. Yet it also reaffirms its limitations by reducing the Chicano framework to an engendered Mexican American male perspective. Feminists within the movement decried gender inequity and countered with the feminine ending in Chicana. There is a whole slew of canonical Chicana feminist writings that are part of the interdisciplinary sources informing visual artists' work, such as Alma Lopez's Our Lady, which was inspired by Sandra Cisneros' essay, Guadalupe, the Sex Goddess. Indigeneity is a major theme within the movement, with scholars looking to the ancient world. Author Ana Castillo's term Chicanismo takes the X prefix from the Nahuatl language in order to broaden Chicana feminism. For example, featured Bay Area collective Dignidad Rebelde specifically cites Chicanismo as a theoretical framework informing their artistic practice in their biography. Chicanx, which combines the Nahuatl Chicana feminist nod with a gender-neutral and non-binary suffix, is the latest conceptual reinterpretation and one with which featured artist Michael Machaca aligns. I refer to Chicano as an open source term, recalling the practice within software development that allows the public to modify and improve the source code based on a shared value system of community-driven betterment. The modification of Chicano as a term and as a set of decolonial principles will only improve with the contribution and acknowledgement of the diverse communities that comprise it. This recurring change challenges a preconceived notion of control or an ownership of this movement by any one group of people. Instead, it opens and reifies the initial objective of the term's inception, to decolonize one's mind. End quote. The desire to provide an exact definition for the term was finally realized in the exhibition's press release. The entry read, "Note about terms. The museum uses the term Chicano to refer to the historical Chicano movement in the United States, starting roughly in 1965, and its participants. Chicana references women who fought for and prefer this designation. Chicanx is a current inclusive designation that is gender neutral and non-binary." The uncertainty around the fundamental term guiding the exhibition reflected one of its central challenges in its development. The unfamiliarity with these conceptual questions represented the lack of experience that institutions have with hosting these types of works, and therefore have little to no precedent for their overarching approaches in these objects' analysis. This resulted in a required multi-generational comprehension of understanding the historical Chicano movement while translating the contemporary practices in development by younger generations. The necessary nuance for these interpretations often reflected museum staff's lack of experience with Chicanx and Latinx art, artists, and communities. The inexperience with Chicano art was also reflected in the museum's acquisition process for the exhibition. The pre-2020 development of the exhibition was primarily centered on the hundreds of new acquisitions and the associated mass approval processes. For Smithsonian, every artwork must be delivered to the museum and reviewed by the curatorial team, conservation specialists, and the executive director. The sheer volume resulted in rapid presentations that would cover artist biographies, object analysis, political context, and print center history. While this posed a daunting challenge to convey a holistic representation of proposed acquisitions, one of the key aspects to these negotiations were the artwork's prices. For example, this zine by Eric J. Garcia, Chicano Codices Number 1, Simplified Histories, the U.S. Invasion of Mexico, 1846 to 1848, from 2015, was selling for $2. Strategically using the codex format to recall the accordion-style books associated with Mesoamerican civilizations, Garcia satirizes the events and aftermath of the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. He personifies the United States as Uncle Sam and Mexico as a welcoming person unaware of Uncle Sam's ambitions. The artist's portrayal of Uncle Sam recalls political cartoons produced in the early 20th century, a period of U.S. imperialist expansion in the Caribbean and Pacific. The history of manifest destiny, or the idea that the United States was destined to inhabit a large swath of North America from sea to shining sea, are central themes for Chicano artists. The Mexican American War, which resulted in Mexico ceding the Southwest and California to the US, is a recurring historical marker. The artist's personal experience as a member of the US Air Force who was stop lost or mandated to have an involuntary extension of service led him to portray military critiques throughout his artistic career. Garcia's approach to sharing this work relies on financial accessibility. Therefore, his pricing model is centralized around mass access and community engagement rather than limited edition fine art price points. This pricing approach resulted in registrars assuming a clerical error and administration assuming the lesser price made such works inherently less valuable and more commercial. The sticker shock for several of the works represented the marginalized role Chicano, Chicana, and Chicanx artists play in secondary markets with a general lack of gallery representation and a limited collector base. These outsider experiences created questions around value, often with artist bio, given the lack of recognizable mainstream career benchmarks like solo retrospectives, specific institutional collection representation, Whitney biennial selections, auction sales, and an interconnected place within a specific network of contemporary artist groups. Another unique hurdle to the acquisition processes was the introduction of shareable graphics. Shareable graphics are a new chapter to the study of Chicanx art history, with artists disseminating their digital images across the internet and social media platforms. Artists distribute these works to aid in solidarity efforts, political protest, and social advocacy. Some shareable graphics are meant to continue their circulation in physical form, with artists providing a higher quality image for people to download and print. Others primarily exist in online forums geared toward inciting dialogue and creating a wider network distribution. At no cost to audiences, shareable graphics function as did early protest posters in efforts to gain momentum for social causes and assert the presence of marginalized groups. However, in this digital space, online dialogue emerges between users and graphics that offers unprecedented exposure, user interactivity, and interpretation. Political cartoonist and media maker Lalo Alcaraz created I Stand with Emma for mass distribution. In February 2018, high school senior X Gonzalez survived the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Days later, they gave an impassioned speech on live television advocating for stronger gun control. Algaraz digitally illustrated Gonzalez's portrait after watching their televised address. He then posted it on his social media channels, asking people to distribute it online or download a high-resolution file from his website for personal printing. The image features "We Call BS," a line from Gonzalez's now famous speech. In the lower register, hashtag gun control now and hashtag stand with the kids add to the social media centered trending tags used to lobby for solidarity and gun reform. In a 2012 post on the microblogging site Tumblr, Mexican artist Julio Salgado sought out other people like him who were undocumented and queer, or undocuqueers, as the artist calls them. While he did not create the term, he has been a leader in popularizing its usage, especially on online networks. For this undocuqueer project, Salgado asked undocumented followers for a photo of themselves and a personal reflection on their intersectional identities. The artist turned these images and statements into works that circulate on digital platforms and provide undocuqueer online users with a sense of community and empowerment. Salgado's artistic activism has made him one of the most recognizable dreamers and DACA recipients in the United States. When these works were presented for acquisition, there was an immediate confusion as to what exactly the museum would own. Would the museum receive a digital file that we would then use to print out a physical copy? Questions around exclusivity led the conversation. Would the files be a unique copy, wherein our version was part of an edition similar to time-based media sales? The prominent concern was that anyone could have a similar digital file to what would be in the Smithsonian collection, and therefore our relationship to this digital artwork was not exclusive. The offline and online project Justice for Our Lives by Bay Area artist Uri Original was another digitally based artwork that was a cause for concern. The Black Lives Matter movement inspired project from 2014 to 2020 was created as part of the artist's social justice work. Using photographs, Original created black and white digital portraits of people killed during altercations with law enforcement and victims of the carceral state. The artist makes each portrait available for download on his website, aimed at community members to use by downloading and printing the portraits or sharing online. Additionally, Original creates dynamic we-pasted public interventions throughout the Bay Area. His activist portraiture has been integrated into several protests for Bay Area victims. Original's acquisition was prior to 2020, and while the Black Lives Matter movement was still present and integrated into an international activist network, the powerful presence the activist art and Black-centered experiences had in 2020 was not a high priority for museums in a pre-2020 world. As such, our desire to center this series was an ambitious commitment to this work that we featured prominently at the exhibition's entrance. So this is what the show looked like at the entrance in Washington, D.C. for this exhibition. In 2020, with an opening date in November, we were finalizing acquisitions, editing the 344-page catalog, but by March 13th, the entire Smithsonian system closed as a result of the coronavirus epidemic. The COVID-19 reshift from museum project management altered exhibition development, shipping, photography, and all of the elements to preparing an exhibition. The distance between departments, coworkers, and the featured artwork resulted in dramatic recalibration and relationship to all things digital. The uncertainty around the quarantine periods and the museum closures resulted in unique protocols for entering into office spaces and art storage each week. The eventual acceptance of the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in redesigns and rethinking of visitor interactions in public galleries. Beyond mask requirements, social distancing placards, and increased sanitizing stations, several areas of the exhibition had to incorporate different technologies to accommodate a no-touch experience. For example, we implemented hand motion sensors for a featured theme within the show. The subsection titled Changemakers, which focused on the use of portraiture, included several biographies and historical context for the highlighted iconic figures. In this section, so this last image right here, so this was attached to this portraiture section. So this right here, what you're looking at on this wall, there would have been a portal that you would have waved your hand in, and it would have shown you images related to that person that who's the sitter for the portrait, and then historical photos that were really the inspiration for the artwork. Unfortunately, that's not here, but you get the idea. So in this section, we featured two large walls with 2 rows of portraits. As with many of the works in the exhibition, there was a challenge to contextualize represented people, political moments, artistic practices, and international history into an accompanying brief label. A common practice for many of the Chicano artists was to visually reference a historical photograph. And to showcase this connection, we created this motion sensor kiosk. Once you waved your hand over the sensor, bilingual text provided information related to the artwork and the featured person in the prints. Chicano artists employed political portraiture to recognize the lives and deeds of those who have fought for political, civil, and human rights, but are excluded in school books or curricula. To challenge these omissions, artists choose to highlight individuals from the past and present whose actions have shaped the course of history. Many of these portraits rely on historic photographs and quote their sitters or recount their achievements. Employed in this way, portraiture becomes a useful vehicle that shifts attention away from privilege, self aggrandizement, and vanity toward activism, sacrifice, and social transformation. For example, Rene Castro features Victor Jara, a leftist folk singer who was apprehended, tortured, and killed during the early days of Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile. Here he depicts a youthful Jara rendered in intense colors alongside a hopeful lyric from one of his songs. Castro often created prints to raise awareness of international struggles against dictatorship and war, especially those marked by U.S. intervention. Mexican revolutionary figures continue to be symbolic iconography for political resistance. Leonard Castellano featured print Rifa includes a psychedelic hued portrait of Emiliano Zapata, one of the most celebrated leaders of the Mexican Revolution. Chicano artists saw themselves as continuing Zapata's resistant efforts for land and indigenous rights. Beneath the portrait, the artist includes the Chicano slang phrase "rifa," which means we are the best. This boastful reference is common among early Chicano arts iconography. Labor leaders are a prominent subject of Chicano portraiture and are ever present throughout the exhibition. Major Chicano printmaker Rupert Garcia includes an Emma Tenayuca portrait for this Chicano Studies Conference promotional poster. To create this print, Garcia relied on a historical photograph of Tenayuca. In 1938, labor organizer and community activist Tenayuca led a successful pecan sheller strike in San Antonio. Her prolific activism began in her teen years, and she remained on the front lines of labor organization until she was forced to leave Texas out of fear for her safety. In their work, Chicano artists frequently resurrect earlier radical figures, such as Tenayuca, to reveal precursors to Chicano activism. This 1977 poster promotes one of the earliest convenings of the National Caucus of Chicano Social Scientists, later known as the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies. Formed in 1972, the organization remains dedicated to supporting and disseminating Chicanx scholarship. The uncertainty around museum closures also prompted the need for more digital content to provide exhibition experiences for those unable to travel to DC, as well as in the event of unforeseen long-term closures based on COVID outbreaks. Smithsonian American Art Museum had created virtual reality-based exhibition experiences in the past with the Renwick Gallery's 2015 exhibition Wonder. The necessity in the pandemic era for virtual replications of a quote digital twin making wherein the virtual space is attempting to recreate as best the gallery experience. Other perspectives embrace the digital format as an open framework that does not aim to replicate an in-person architecture, rather a narrative multimodal experience. For the printing exhibition, we did a state of the field, looking at the most relevant software available for creating a walkthrough of an exhibition space. The digital team originally pushed for a VR approach using the same software as the Wonder app from 2015, but we ended up agreeing on Matterport. This software is common for real estate listings and museums. This software is common for real estate listings, and museums have taken to this as a common supplement to their exhibitions. To create this capture, you need a 360 camera, and to create hotspots for users to have specific sightlines in the virtual space. The final product was this, where the user can click at their leisure through the galleries as though they're moving at their own pace. The drawbacks for this format, as we reflected on this project, were accessibility needs regarding users who may not be able to click a certain number of times, or screen readers being unable to translate the content on screen. This resulted in more content making, including an audio version of walking through the exhibition that is now on YouTube in English and Spanish. While the pandemic was a major hurdle to project management and the development of the exhibition, the political realities of the 2020 moment were also ever present and cause for concern. Each exhibition at the Smithsonian that has, quote, sensitive content must be reviewed by several high-level administrators. In this review process, the curatorial team has to discuss its research process and create responses to potential controversy and public concerns. One of the concerns was the timing of promotional material for the exhibition and the upcoming 2020 national election. The overall fear among the teams was the possibility that images from the exhibition would be culled from press and weaponized against the Smithsonian Museum, Latinx art, or the curatorial team. The controversial interpretation of many of the represented figures in the exhibition, such as Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and Lolita Lebron, were the focus for many concerns. Artists like Bay Area printmaker Juan Fuentes prominently featured Castro in his untitled 1975 calendar print. In this scene, he captures the 1961 historic moment when a group of Cuban exiles, backed by the United States, centered Cuba at the beachside village of Playa Girón in an unsuccessful attempt to topple Fidel Castro. The event, widely known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, worsened U.S.-Cuban relations and exposed U.S. interventionist tactics in Latin America. Fuentes' print, which portrays Castro jumping off a tanker during the armed encounter, hails the event a triumph against U.S. imperialism. Another Bay Area artist, Herbert Sigüenza, features Castro in his 1982 calendar print. Using the colors of the Cuban flag, Sigüenza presents a profile of a youthful Castro alongside the phrase "Siempre es 26," it's always the 26th, a reference to Castro's July 26th guerrilla movement, to convey the patriotic tenor of his early rise. Following the end of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, leftists around the world respected Fidel Castro and his supporters because they had ousted dictator Fulgencio Batista and unsettled the United States' economic stronghold over Cuba. However, opinions of Castro would change as his government became increasingly authoritarian, thus making these artistic references crystallize in a specific historical lens. When the subsequent Capitol insurrection occurred in January 2021, there were citywide curfews, street closures, and an armed perimeter in downtown DC. To enter in our museum offices, I had to go through a military checkpoint where I showed my badge, as seen here. The then administration's continued presence created a programmatic instability where we moved online program dates in case of an additional attack in DC. One of the portraits in our Changemakers section included Puerto Rican activist Lolita Lebron. In 1954, she and three others fired shots into the U.S. House of Representatives and demanded full independence for Puerto Rico, which had become a U.S. Commonwealth 2 years earlier. 5 members of Congress were injured. For her role as the leader of the attack, Lebron served half of a 50-year prison sentence before she was granted clemency by President Jimmy Carter. She continues to be an iconic figure in the ongoing movement for Puerto Rican independence. Bay Area artist Linda Zamora Lucero created the screen print after learning about Lolita Lebron after she traveled to Cuba as a college student. Lucera, who sympathized with her cause, wedded Lebron's likeness and words to the Puerto Rican flag, which appear beneath her pensive portrait. After the insurrection, Lebron's biography made the rounds of news outlets regarding the disparate treatment of rioters at the Capitol. Going back to 2020, the most significant moment besides the pandemic was the racial reckoning and the increased prominence of the Black Lives Matter movement. With the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless other traumatic deaths at the hands of law enforcement, there was a repositioning and reflection of racial injustice in institutions writ large. Museums responded with messages of cultural solidarity, diversity action plans, hiring of diversity and anti-racism officers and consultants, and strategic plans to diversify their collections and employees. The museum's Great Reflection was part of a larger exercise in societal introspection of white supremacy and systemic racism that pervade every aspect of our present existence. And now, in the current moment, all of these efforts are being eliminated or outlawed. In the 2020 societal moment, museums were clamoring to create exhibitions centered on political action, Black voices, anti-oppression, and sought acquisitions of BIPOC artists to present themselves as part of this transformative era. For Printing the Revolution, the exhibition's content became that much more prescient, but also dated. The influx of 2020 political graphics reacting to COVID, the BLM movement, and the Trump administration were overwhelming and showcased the need for another political graphics exhibition capturing all of the new work created during the pandemic and after. Our last 2 acquisitions were the portraits of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor by the Bay Area artist Uri Original. The speed at which he creates his portraits and uploads them to his website as part of the broader digital intervention is an immediate reaction to the zeitgeist, and we added these images as part of his project acquisition right after Floyd and Taylor's deaths. We prominently featured Floyd and Taylor's portraits in a fold-out within the publication. Due to the closures of the exhibition and the fluctuating calendar of the museum, the publication became the primary outlet of the show to the outside world. As of now, the publication was shortlisted for the Alice Award. It was a finalist for College Art Association's Alfred H. Barr Jr. Prize, an award given to the best museum publication over a 3-year period, and it received the 2022 Association for Latin American Arts Ala Toma Foundation Exhibition Catalog Award. The rise in Zoom also allowed curator Carmen Ramos me to enter several classrooms and institutions. Here's a listing of some of them, and present on the exhibition despite the museum being closed. The increased comfort and practice of this ed tech space facilitated a touring of the exhibition through our online presentations. The museum's education department also created a classroom teaching poster set to engage with educators, featuring 5 screen prints from the exhibition and collection. This resource went viral and resulted in over 10,000 poster requests from educators all over the world. Printing the Revolution is now on its last stop, and as have experienced thus far with the exhibition traveling, each venue and region will interact with the concepts, terminology, and artwork in a unique capacity based on the printmaking and agricultural communities, national political climate, and Latino presence in each region. The works of Printing the Revolution represent a long-standing tradition of resistance against oppression that, as we have seen in the last years, these images are vital to translating the demanding changes that audiences want and deserve. Thank you. Great. Yeah. What did a work of art particularly speak to you? Lolita Lebron. Yes. Lolita Lebron is one of the major Puerto Rican resistance fighter and just general people thinking about radicalism and revolution and historical figures. She is one of those. For many people, they don't know who she is. And that was really the role of Chicano portraiture and Chicano printmaking, was to really rethink the history books, to really examine who needs to be remembered and why. And there are a handful of Lolita images, and it's a really good example of also Chicano portraiture and Chicano printmaking not being just about Mexico or Los Angeles or Texas or something like that. It's an international solidarity with international experiences and really thinking about the US, really thinking about imperialism at home and in this interesting state that Puerto Rico is, but really understanding it's beyond just Mexico. And that's what previous exhibitions didn't necessarily get into, that of examining people who were not Mexican, but were still kind of part of the printmaking, and just really how international a dialogue this really was.
How do you make a decision from any exhibit
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. And this presentation, so I studied museum studies, which is really thinking about the how do you craft an exhibition. And as a curator, it's kind of a different experience than just necessarily being a scholar, because you have to think about several teams all at once, communities, visitors. Is a different experience than just writing a book and kind of putting it in a bookshelf and there it goes out into the world. As this exhibition travels, so usually if it's a really large exhibition with a great budget, like Smithsonian has a great budget, usually people want the exhibition to travel so it can get more exposure. Because we're dealing with works on paper, it can only travel so long. And that's why this is the last stop for this exhibition. So in reality, they shouldn't be up that long. They need a lot of breaks. Like after this goes back to DC, many of these works won't be seen for many, many years. So it's quite a treat that you get to see it right before they all go to bed. And when we're thinking about museums receiving the traveling show, there are modifications to certain things, like maybe information on a label that needs to get tweaked, or which works go into the next iteration of the exhibition based on the square footage of the traveling institution. So I worked with the director on what would be the next images to come from the main exhibition, but ultimately it's up to the institution. the traveling institution, which works they want. Based on certain contracts with the Smithsonian, there are certain things that can't be changed in terms of like labels and like we can't change the title of the show to like Rollins Museum of Art, Chicano, print extravaganza. Like you can't go to that. It's got to stay put, but you're only seeing such a small fraction of the original show. But it is challenging because ideally you want everything to travel. But it's just, imagine your luggage, you can only take so much. You can't take your cat and dog with you. It has to be certain elements of from each section, each thematic section from its original construction to make sure we have a little bit of everything. But the original 119 works are not here. It's challenging here, let's go to that graphic that I used at the beginning of this. So when we're thinking about terminology, when we're thinking about the online space, for example, like let's say you were on a website or if you were on Facebook or Instagram or something like that, and someone wrote something and put a hashtag and they put hashtag Chicanx or Chican, or they put Latinx, or they put this certain term that they want to use. In that moment, that's called a folksonomy, that a community drives its own kind of identity in that space, that specific organizing nomenclature. You can change that concept very quickly. You decided to author that tag, author that digital content. That's very quick. And that's interesting because you see different communities creating very quickly. But then when we're thinking about an institutional space, like the Research Center for Chicano Studies, to change that takes many years and many meetings and many committees. And it's just, there's a longer process to change. Where in other spaces, it's very rapid and it's very fluid. But when you're thinking about anything where there's this very rigid or institutional or bureaucratic space, it takes much longer to move with the trends. And so they're at different paces technologically. And where a digital space can go very quickly, a governmental space is going to go much slower. So it's interesting when we're thinking about terms like Chicano, Chicanx, or like Latinx, Latine with an E ending, all these things that are changing and happening per someone wanting to change them, it's going to have to get formalized in all these different ways, like department names, titles, books, all those things, but all that takes a long time. Like writing a book takes forever, or even doing an academic article takes several years. So thinking about several years and thinking about how quickly communities can decide and change is very challenging, because when you're developing a show related to something where you've seen all these terms used, there has to be a consensus when you're developing a show. But one faction who prefers one term over the other will always feel like they're not represented. And so there will always be friction there. What we've encountered is if we say Chicanx, the elder generation tends not to like that. They really like Chicano. But then the feminists really want to make sure their A is still there. So we're really thinking about this Spanish language and the engendered endings. And we're thinking about Spanish, but then we're also thinking about gender neutral. We're thinking about a new generation of gender identities, gender expressions. And there's also this misunderstandings of all of that, of gender identity, gender expression, sexuality, linguistics, cultural studies. So if you're really thinking about this one word and this one term, it can mean so many things for so many people, and therefore it's incendiary because of that. So it's a challenge, but it's interesting that it's still going, that it's still alive. That's really the thing, because so many people, when I was a student, they were like, oh, Chicano art is dead. They would just tell me flat out, Chicano art is dead. Why do you want to study that? But then you would see really young people still using the term and calling their artwork Chicano art. You're like, well, why do you say that? Or what? It's a really interesting engagement with the necessity for these labels. Like, why do you want to perpetuate a label from the 1960s? 60 years later, what does that serve? Why the legacy? Why the linguistic legacy? It's an interesting conundrum. Did I answer it? Did I solve it in this moment? No, because it's not supposed to be solved. There's not supposed to be a period, is what I'm saying.
Say group about the collecting and the kind of reframing that this acquisition represented for the American Art Museum, and if that is something that has been said by the museum, and maybe there are other similar acquisitions that kind of have shifted the criteria for acquiring work, or the criteria for acquiring after this.
Yeah, that's a challenging. Like, for example, when it's screen print on paper, there's a hierarchy in the media of art. When people think of art, they often think of a painting, like painting, but it's usually like big, it's like painting. And then sculpture, but then really, if you know art history, like photography is still seen as lower in that it's certainly not as valuable. It just hasn't been as present in the history of art. And screen printing, which the majority of these works are, when we're thinking about works on paper, because they're a multiple, like if you look in the lower left-hand or right-hand corners of the works on paper, there's a fraction. They'll say like 1 out of 20, meaning there was an addition of 20. 20 of those were made, and this is the first one of that. So already the value of that goes lower because there's multiples versus like one Starry Night, one painting. So that work on paper lowers in value. And then also the light sensitivity, it can only be shown for so long. In the history of printmaking, screen printing was really seen as this industrial process, and the Chicanos really liked it because it was cheaper to do. So the print centers, the really fine art print centers, weren't teaching screen printing. Like for your MFAs, you weren't being taught screen printing. It was more of the community-centered educational practices of teaching screen printing to one another. And so already there's a lower valuation associated with screen printing. But then when we're thinking about the acquisitions for Smithsonian, because so much of the drive for many of the artists isn't about the specific lineage of a professional artist, where you need to get your MFA, you need to go to New York, and you need to be represented by a specific gallery, and you need, like, there's all these checkpoints of a contemporary artist to be seen as successful in the history of American art, history of art broadly. So many of these artists in this exhibition are not interested in that career trajectory. They're more interested in community education. A lot of them do have their MFAs. A lot of them are well trained, but there's a different drive for several of them where it's more about the community accessing. It's not about exclusion, where we have that one. It's more about, I hope everybody has it so everybody can learn from it, because the content featured in the artwork is worth exploring and knowing because you don't know it, or it brings up a dialogue that hasn't happened yet, or anything like that. That desire to reckon with the past and engage in the future is worthy of it being at an accessible price. That, I feel like, will always be a challenge for spaces like Smithsonian unless someone's facilitating that conversation, because so much of those rubrics of acceptance and evaluation are just not meant for those types of artists. So you have to really know the artist's biography, their community groups, and their histories, and you have to be well versed in that specific section of art history. Now there are more professors in Latino art history that are teaching, like Lolita, that are teaching about Chicano printmaking. That's only within the last couple of years, and it's still only a handful. So all of that has to change at this whole systematic level where there are professors teaching it, there are collectors buying it. The collector part of this process is really the challenging part because it's not one or two lots, Christie's, that is done related to Latino art. But other than that, there's really never been. So these prices and the valuation of these things, there's no reference point. Like my position as associate curator of Latino art, I'm the first one. So there's no reference for a lot of these new things. The show, I call Chicano art exhibitions eclipse shows because they happen like every 10 years, every 20 years. It's so rare and so much has happened. And so this kind of understanding of the subject matter, there are many people well versed in political printmaking, but it has to be so regionally specific to know all the cultural nuance. And translating that onto the East Coast and the Mid-Atlantic is so specific because so much of the conversations are really in the Southwest or Southern California. What's great about the show is that Carmen Ramos, the curator, emphasized Dominican and Puerto Rican artists and their work, and a lot of them are based obviously out of New York, New Jersey. So that was a good addition to usually exhibitions that featured just the West Coast. And doing a show on the East Coast, Texas, for example, is never in the conversation. That's a foreign country. Everything is so foreign and West. So injecting that into an East Coast conversation about art, all that takes so much explaining very quickly. You have to explain this political context, this artistic biography, this community understanding, and this technical practice all in one. There's no reference point for a lot of the artists. I can't say, oh, they work with Warhol. Like, okay, I know that name. Like, there's no like, oh yeah, I know that. They're like, you don't know that person from that neighborhood because you've never been there. Like, it's just so much translation that needs to happen.
Thank you.
There's these one more, two more. Yes, go. Yes.
The definition of sheep, like the word sheep, XY,
Mhm.
right? The sheep in Spanish, old Spanish and pure, right? Have been used there, and also the Mayans, they also use sheep. So how Chicano looks like a construct word, how do they ID themselves? Because whiteness is all over the place. So how do you liberate the mind, all this fighting, and it feels like this is being neutered. So, what's the question there, and how do you answer that question?
It's this conversation about the dialogue and the linguistical dialogue is always going to come up. And it's good that you brought up the ancient world because this is so present in many of the Chicano artists' practice is to reference the ancient world. Ancient Maya, ancient Aztec, Zapotec, Mixtec, all these areas of what we know as Mesoamerica, which are present day Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, and parts of Nicaragua. All that was emphasized in the 1960s movements to create this connection to challenging Western history. As we started from Europe and then we went up, or we started in a specific way of whiteness, and then everything happened after. So by pointing to the ancient Mesoamerica, language, imagery, ideology, they were creating a new beginning and a new legacy to tie themselves to greatness and these great civilizations of the world. Now, when we're thinking about the ancient world and those linguistic connections, it is still very controversial because we're thinking about indigeneity in a very specific way, where it references the ancient indigenous versus present day indigenous. That's where there's some tension amongst people who embrace indigenous iconography or certain language or certain even fashion and things like that. there's this issue with Chicano communities being detribalized. So there's not necessarily this way where they can affiliate themselves per the governmental regulations of being associated with a specific tribe. So there's more of this idealized version of indigeneity, but still a desire to have a connection and many cultural practices, and including linguistical practices to connect to their indigenous connections. So there's that connection, but then there's the challenge of, are you idealizing it in a controversial way, or you're forgetting the actual and present day indigenous presence in the US and those tribal nations? And this is where there's this big challenge for elder Chicanos and contemporary younger Chicanos about using terms like Aslan, which is about this mythic homeland, and other usages of certain interpretations where we're not thinking about the legacies of tribal nations, but we're thinking about ancient Mesoamerica first. And it's very challenging when you're thinking about all this, because you have to go from the ancient world to the 20th century to 21st. You're thinking about several different interpretations of someone, in this case, Chicano communities, trying to reassign all your histories you've ever been taught and re-examine it and reform it. And in that is very challenging, obviously, because everybody wants to decenter whiteness. Essentially, that's what's the goal. In doing that, many people are going to take different versions of that. But even having that X at the beginning, which references Nahuatl, so Nahuatl is not a dead language. People still use it. There's a Wikipedia Nahuatl. It's still very active. But this is the language of the Aztecs. So even using that X in the front, that's someone waving and saying, I like indigenous communities and cultures. I want to align with that. I want to align with this specific community and this specific history. So even though it's not the best, it's still something. And that's really what the goal is, to have incremental change, because obviously we can't completely rewrite history. We can't remedy all the wrongs, but even having that ending at the end referencing non-binary existence and indigeneity at the beginning is something that challenges what we were told from the beginning about those not being important or non-existent in our learning.